This short video is addressing how to get ready for the final exam. If you're watching this video, you're supposed to have already read through the 5 moral dilemmas that are a file on Canvas. You're going to get one of those on the day of the exam. You don't know which one of them it's going to be. Alright, so our motif is always the same. It is that of archery, of aiming and shooting, and the concept from ancient times and down to the present that when we're doing ethics, we're doing something that is not unlike trying to hit the bullseye. We are aiming for the mark of what is the right moral decision. All right, so we've seen again and again this flow chart, and it's very important that you just really get firmly in your mind how these 3 theories work, that you understand this, that you use it on the day of the final exam. On the far left here is utilitarianism. So with utilitarianism, what we're dealing with is the idea of the greatest good for the greatest number of people, and the individuals who represent this, the ones from whom it comes, is Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. I'd remind you that Bentham's way of getting at the greatest good for the greatest number of people is by employment of the measure of pleasure. He uses the hedonic calculus. How long, how strong, how certain, how soon, what's the likelihood of more of this pleasure, and what's the likelihood of no more, how many people are going to benefit from it. Mill's is a little bit more complex, a little bit less mathematical, and he's addressing it in terms of happiness. So happiness is the pleasures both of the body and also of the mind. The second ethics of conduct is not looking to outcomes like utilitarianism is. Utilitarianism is not saying what's my duty, what should I do. It's saying what will bring about the greatest outcome, and I'm going to select that. So deontology says what is my duty, and it has a very specific way of measuring duty. This is a Kantian approach. It's Immanuel Kant's way of thinking. Kant has 3 ingredients for how we arrive at the moral good. First of all, you have to start with a good will. Secondly, you need to then use the first formulation of the categorical imperative, which says, act according to that maxim or that law, whereby you can at the same time will that it should be a universal law. So that when you're making your decision about what to do morally, it has to be that you could advise everybody else who finds themselves in a situation like yours, do this. If you can't recommend it to everybody else, then you're using special reasoning just for yourself. The second of these categorical imperatives, sometimes called the practical imperative, is the idea of it's a means-ends principle. So the first one, the first formulation of the categorical imperative is a universalizability principle. I can universalize it for everybody. The second one is the means-ends principle, which is we never use human beings as a mere means to an end. We always remember that when we're dealing with human beings, they are ends in themselves. They have intrinsic value and worth. So this is saying what is my duty in terms of those 3 ingredients. A good will, the first formulation of the categorical imperative, and the second formulation of the categorical imperative. When we approach things from the other of these 3 theories, we're not saying or asking what should I do. That's conduct, what do I do? We're thinking in terms of ethics of character. Ethics of character says what does it look like for me to be a woman of virtue, a man of virtue in this given situation. And this is called virtue ethics. It harkens back to Aristotle, and it was revived by Elizabeth Anscombe and brought into the foreground such that it's the fastest growing of these 3 schools at this point in time in history. Okay, so you've got to be able to reason on the day of the final exam from those 3 directions, and you've got to analyze things from them. So the final exam ethical dilemmas are number 1, Nurse Osika and the neo-Nazi. You have presumably an Asian American, sounds like Japanese American nurse, who is a head nurse in a newborn intensive care unit, and she has a neo-Nazi father who does not want any African American nurses near his child. And of course, there's these 2 issues, the one of racial equality, but also the other one of the concern for the safety of the baby. That if we resist this guy, he may take this baby who needs to be in here out of the hospital, which legally he can do. Dilemma 2 is the racial identity disorder. Rachel Dolezal, who was an American college professor and also the president of the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in the place where she lived, and it turned out that it was all false, that she's white, although she has ideation of always having thought of herself as being black. And there's a documentary about this on Netflix these days, and about how this woman has had this thought. Now, the issue with this is how it's got some comparisons between it and being transgender. That's what all of these dilemmas, by the way, come from the college level ethics bowls for the United States, where schools compete against one another in trying to address ethical dilemmas. So these are not mine. I didn't invent them, except for the one. The one comes from me. That's a little further on. I'll tell you which one that is. Okay, the Amish midwives is another one. These are midwives who decide to give inoculations to babies who are being born, and do so without the proper medical training. What should be the response to that? The one that's not from the college ethics bowls is Jed and Amanda. Jed and Amanda are friends whom I know, and who have given me permission to use their first names, who adopted 2 children from Haiti, and, well, you've read the dilemma, hopefully. The last one is the Talvarez family, which is raising theybies. Not babies, but theybies, which is a term for not telling the child what its sex is, not having them have clothes that identify their sex, or even haircuts that identify their sex, and so the child chooses their gender, as it were. So when we're dealing with the first one, with Nurse Osika and the neo-Nazi, values such as liberty and equality are sometimes said to be incommensurable, meaning you can't compare them. We're comparing apples and oranges, in the sense that their value cannot be reduced down to a common measure. We can't say I got this much of this and this much of that and balance them in the scales, as it were. So in the case of Nurse Osika and Tonya Battles, who's the African-American nurse who's been told that she's not to take care of this infant, and the neo-Nazi father, the rub that you feel is the incommensurability between the concern for the safety of the newborn and also the concern for the African-American nurses, and the issue of racial inequality and racism not being able to, we don't cave into a neo-Nazi. So if you want to give a good analysis of the dilemma, you really need to address the incommensurability of physical safety and racial equality. They both matter, but which one matters to you more, and why? And going on, what's the big concern with a racial identity disorder? We now have not only people who identify as being white when they're not, but we also have people who identify as being blind and who are putting out their vision. And they're saying, I've always identified as being blind, and so I want to be part of the blind community. And other things like that. People who identify as being amputees when they have limbs that work just fine, and they feel uncomfortable having a right hand, so they cut their right hand off. And so the issue is brought up by the racial identity disorder, is the issue of, does my ideation that I'm a certain way, does that indicate that I really am that on the inside? Or is it perhaps a case of that I have something going wrong mentally? And the racial identity disorder brings us to the fore. What's our primary concern with the Amish midwives? You've got to think that through. Why is Jed and Amanda's experience with the adoption of their children during the aftermath of the earthquake in Haiti even an issue? And it's an issue, I think, because they were slightly dishonest. They didn't feel that they had any choice. They presumed upon the presuppositions of the officials in Haiti, who assumed that they'd been approved to adopt these children. Lastly, what are the competing concerns, which is kind of similar to incommensurability, in the story of the Talvarez family and their child-rearing decisions, and which concerns should be most important? So there's some psychological issues that psychologists think are concerning when a child does not know what its sex is going to choose for themselves. And then there's other concerns as far as people feeling that gender is a social construct and it's something that we're superimposing on children and they should be able to choose their own gender. Okay, so final exam, those are the 5 dilemmas. One of those is what you're going to be dealing with on the day of the final exam. Here's what your final exam will look like. I've shortened the paper just so you can see it all on one slide. But you're going to need, as you can see up above, you're going to need, number 1, to identify how you think the 3 primary schools of ethics would respond to the dilemma before you. Let's say it's the racial identity disorder, and then you have to give your own response. Your personal answer to the challenge, which is the number 2, need not line up with any particular school of ethics. You will, however, need to defend your answer. Here's the thing. Each part of this is worth 25 points. So the utilitarian response is worth 25 points. The deontological response is worth 25 points. The virtue ethics response is worth 25 points. And then your personal response is worth 25 points. You really can't get your own personal response wrong. It's yours. And so I'm giving you 25 points out of the starting gates, as long as you don't say something absolutely bizarre and crazy and antithetical to human well-being and flourishing. But with the other three, you need to be able to reason to the greatest good of the greatest number of people and use either pleasure or happiness. You need to, when we're dealing with deontological analysis of the dilemma, you need to be able to start with a good will and to identify your duty in terms of the first and the second formulations of the categorical imperative. And with a virtue ethics response, you've got to be able to identify some specific virtues that come into play in this situation. Loyalty, honesty, whatever it might be, courage, that may be something that needs to be used. But you have to identify, and you also have to speak in terms of what would in this situation ultimately make for eudaimonia, or for flourishing, thriving, well-being of the human beings involved. And so the first two are thinking in terms of, what do I do? Utilitarianism and deontology are ethics of conduct. The third one is thinking in terms of, what does it look like for me to be virtuous? So you're going to have a version of this form that you see before you. And that's it, guys. So that's how to get ready for the final exam.